Well, if I were to ask you who was the most famous missionary of all time, you probably would answer the Apostle Paul, and I would have a hard time arguing with you. But when you think about the period following the era of the apostles, uh, there are lots of other people whom you could suggest. And one of the individuals that always rises to the top is this gentleman right here. And I'm guessing that some of you may recognize who this is. He is called the father of modern missions, and his name is William Carey. It's pretty difficult to think of someone who has received more attention and more emphasis as a faithful missionary than William Carey. And he's an interesting study. William Carey, just like everybody else we're studying, had his imperfections, and yet God greatly used him for reasons that we'll discuss here as we talk about him. William Carey lived from 1761 to 1834. And he was English. Remember, in these early years, a lot of the people who served the Lord in foreign missions were from England. As you probably understand, the missionary movement became less and less pronounced in England and more pronounced in the colonies here in the United States over time. And that many people have lamented the fact that missions in England and in Europe in general, became so slight compared to what they had once been. And we see the same thing happening in our own country. Missions not carrying the same weight and having the same emphasis that they had had in years past. And there's a lot of discussion surrounding the whys and wherefores of that. Now, William Carey served the Lord in India. Okay, and just a little note of background: you may be aware that his country, England, had some pretty profound activities, some pretty deep roots in the country of India. They started what was called the East India Company, and they were heavily involved in trade. And there were other countries that also had their establishments in India as well, and that's quite an interesting study. So a lot of colonialism was taking place among the English in the country of India at that time. Um, why is it that William Carey is referred to as the father of modern missions? Remember, modern missions is a period that we designate from about 1800, which is about the time he served, until the present day. And that century, from 1800 to 1900, is what is commonly called the Great Century of Missions. And William Carey is considered the spark plug of that great century of missions. So let's talk a little bit about him. He established what became known as the Baptist Missionary Society. Now, just pause for a second. We're living in a day when mission agencies are very, very common. I could ask probably any one of you to give me the names of 2 or 3 mission agencies, and several would come to mind. Here at Faith, we interact with dozens of missions agencies who are seeking young people, graduates of our college who have a heart to serve the Lord and would be willing to come on board with them. But mission agencies is relatively new. Now, when I say new, I'm not talking about the last 15 or 20 years. I'm talking about the last couple of hundred years. In 1800, William Carey spawned the idea of a missionary society because he believed that it would be important and advantageous for missionaries to be able to team up together and to share their ideas and their resources with one another. All right, and notice the name of the missionary society that he founded, the Baptist Missionary Society. we don't use the word society today when we're talking about mission agencies. We prefer the word agency. Some refer to these agencies as missions boards. All right. Why the word society? Part of the reason for the word is that society, rather than communicating authority, communicated fellowship. And so it wasn't called the Baptist Missionary Board. And I'm not against the word board necessarily, but the word board does seem to suggest the idea of a hierarchy. Now, in his day, I'm not even sure if the word board even existed. I think it's a term that came to be more around the turn of the 1900s. And I'm not totally sure of that, the exact date of that. But society was a term that communicated fellowship rather than authority. Because Carey, just like others of his day, believed in the centrality of the local church when it came to missions. A missionary society should not be overseeing a local church in sending out missionaries. In fact, it should be quite the other way around. The only institution that Jesus established when he was here on earth was the local church. In fact, he said, remember in Matthew 16, I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. It's not wrong to have missions societies or agencies, as long as we remember that they are never to usurp the authority of the local church. Unfortunately, some churches along the way have actually kind of conceded their authority to mission agencies using the justification that agencies know more about missions. They're the ones that spend all day long and all week long doing missionary work. They have the resources, they have the experience, and so on, and therefore they should be in charge. Well, that's a dangerous way of thinking. The local church always needs to be at the center of the missionary enterprise because that's the institution that Jesus established. If the church wants to take advantage of other resources like missions agencies, for example, or to think of it a little differently, churches take advantage of camp ministries and Bible college ministries. All of those are legitimate, but none of them can replace the authority and autonomy of the local church. So he started the Baptist Missionary Society, which kind of began this whole movement of Baptist mission societies or agencies, if you will. And so the London Missionary Society was born, and boy, if you go and just type in mission agencies or mission societies on a Google search, you will find all kinds of examples out there. And so he was known for that. Now, Carey was an unusually gifted man. I've only given you two examples of ministries here, evangelism and Bible translation. But Carey was, probably wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that he was a genius. He really was interested in botany even as a young man, even before he became a missionary. And he wanted to serve the Lord somehow using his botanical skills. And in fact, even when he went to India, he used gardening and planting of trees and shrubs and so on as a way to create ministry there and to establish himself and to draw attention of people who needed the Lord and that sort of thing. He did that. His ability in languages was amazing. He translated the Word of God into one of the Indian dialects and also into some other local dialects. And just exactly how many, I don't know, but he did a lot of work. He also worked on translating Bible dictionaries and other tools that the Indian pastors and leaders could use in ministry. One story told about William Carey that's especially interesting is that at one point when he was away from his work, the facility where he had stored all of his translations caught fire and they were all destroyed. And when he found out about it, what did he do? He came back, he sat down, he picked up his pen, and he started all over again. He didn't blow up. He didn't get mad at God. He didn't decide to quit. This isn't worth it. You know, he just got to work and did it all over again. He himself made the comment that as he evaluated his own life, he viewed himself as a plotter. He said, there are a lot of things I don't know how to do, but one thing I can do well is plod. And that's what he was. William Carey was a plotter. Uh, Carey did have some struggles when it came to his domestic life. Uh, Carey married a woman whose name was Dorothy, and Dorothy Carey never did really adjust well to missionary life. For one thing, they went to the field of India when they had a couple of small children, and she was pregnant with another, and she just considered it bad timing, but she finally gave in and said she was willing to go along. And the long and the short of it is she struggled from A to Z in the ministry. Now, there's a whole book written about her called Dorothy Carey, and you can read that and get some information. I think we need to be really, really careful about coming down hard on Dorothy. I do think that there's some room for blame on her part, but at the same time, Carey was a man who was very passive as a husband and father. And he got so buried in his translation work and his ministry work that he often neglected his own family. And that certainly had to have an impact on Dorothy negatively, especially given the fact that she was already struggling with the adjustment to the Indian culture. And especially the heat there was very, very difficult for her. And so, in fact, Carey had a couple of co-workers that actually probably saved his family, if I can say that, humanly speaking. They were called the Semaphore Trio because the three of them worked together in Serampore, India, where they were stationed. And these other two gentlemen kind of helped to look after his kids when they noticed that he was being neglectful. And as a result of that, one of them ended up in ministry, and I'm not totally sure about where the other ones ended up. And by the way, I'm not saying that if you don't end up in ministry that you're somehow out of the will of God. I'm simply saying that at least one of them, really ended up having the zeal to serve God in that way as his father had, despite some of the neglect in the home. And so that's an interesting story in and of itself. The story is also told that his wife had gotten so bad that she started publicly yelling out accusations of moral infidelity on his part, which could never be substantiated, and that even at his first baptism, he had to wait 7 years to baptize his first convert because the ministry there was difficult, and he was baptizing his first converts while she was across the other side of the river, yelling out all sorts of obscenities about her husband. So, things got really, really bad for her. And, but again, I think that there is fault on both sides. And I would encourage you to be very cautious about being judgmental without knowing all the facts. In all of these cases, when we study missionaries historically, we have only certain facts to go on that historians have collected and recorded. And so we always have to be very, very careful. I mean, I don't think any of us would want someone to judge us because of something that happened in our ministries or our lives without having all the baggage and an adequate foundation for what they are saying. The other thing I would just say in closing about William Carey is that probably one of his most famous statements is when allegedly he was with a group of pastors and he was expressing his burden to go overseas and be a missionary. And one of the men who was in that meeting stood up and he said, young man, sit down. When God is ready to reach the heathen, he'll do it without your help or mine. Now, I just want to say that the background for that statement will help to explain why somebody would say something like that. During the age of the Reformation, during the era of the Reformation, many, if not most of the Reformation leaders kind of adopted this idea that the Great Commission was for the apostolic era. It was fulfilled by the apostles. It ceased to function after that. And there's a lot to be said about that issue. And so even when William Carey was talking about going to India, the influence of the reformers on some of his colleagues is what caused them to say what they said. And yet he wrote a response to that that's called the Inquiry. It's a long name, but the short name of it is Carey's Inquiry. And I would encourage you to get a hold of that and read it, where he justifies the ongoing mandate of Jesus Christ, not just for the apostles, but for the entire church. And that has made a great impact on world missions. So, boy, William Carey, we could spend so much time just talking about him and his ministry, just like everybody else, flawed, but yielded to God with a heart to serve him, and what an impact he's made on missions history.